Story 1.
As the first rays of the morning sun broke through the thick crowns of the towering trees, a transformation began. The vast expanse of ancient forest stirred under the cold breath of dawn. The mist, ethereal and ghostly, began its slow dance over the ground. It crept with the patience of time, a white spirit weaving its light blanket over the earth. This mist, seemingly sentient, found its way through every nook, cradling each bush, tree, and blade of grass in its chilly embrace. In this early hour, the air held a peculiar transparency, a crystal clarity that magnified the world's dormant beauty. Every inhalation brought with it an icy freshness, a sharp reminder of the world's awakening. The ground, hardened by the kiss of frost, offered resistance underfoot. Each step crunched through the fresh snow, a sound akin to ancient parchment being carefully unfolded, revealing secrets long hidden. This was no solitary journey. The steady, rhythmic footsteps of people moving through the forest broke the sanctity of the morning, an intrusion of human existence into the natural symphony. Their breaths, visible in the frosty air, created ephemeral clouds that vanished as quickly as they appeared, a fleeting testament to their presence in this untouched world. Around them, the forest was a kingdom of frost. The landscape, draped in a layer of frozen dew, glistened and shimmered in the sun's embrace. Each ray of light, filtering through the canopy, transformed the ice into countless gems, a treasure trove scattered indiscriminately by some generous, unseen hand. As the group ventured deeper, the forest's character shifted. The snow-laden branches of the trees bent gracefully under their burden, forming natural arches and tunnels. Sunlight, in its quest to touch the earth, broke through these formations, scattering the fog and revealing the forest's hidden depths. Amidst this serene backdrop, a moment of discord arose. One of the men halted, his hand outstretched, pointing ahead. Through the thinning veil of fog, a disturbing tableau slowly came into focus. At the base of a majestic tree, whose roots delved deep into the frozen earth, lay a body. A man, his clothes in tatters, his skin marred and bloody. His stillness was unsettling, a stark contrast to the life that surrounded him. The air itself seemed to recoil from the scent of death that lingered, an unspoken truth hanging heavily. Approaching cautiously, the group moved closer, their presence a reluctant disturbance to the scene's eerie calm. The man's body was a testament to a violent end, the final chapter of his story, written in the language of struggle. Around him, scattered possessions lay strewn, remnants of a life abruptly severed. His face, locked in an expression of horror, seemed to gaze upon an unseen terror, a secret held in his eternal silence. The silence that followed was not just an absence of sound, but a weight that pressed upon each member of the group. It was a silence filled with unspoken questions, with the ghost of a story, yet untold. As the young park ranger, Chris, crossed the threshold of the small, seemingly dormant town, his gaze meandered through the picturesque landscape that lay before him. The houses, quaint and unassuming, were scattered like forgotten toys among the undulating hills, their roofs adorned with a delicate frosting of snow. The town, basking in the early morning sun, was a living tableau of tranquility, reminiscent of countless other small towns nestled in the bosom of dense forests and looming mountains. The streets, narrow and serpentine, ran through the heart of the city, surrounded by ancient buildings. Each corner held a stoic silence, as if time itself had paused to admire the scene. It was a stark contrast to the bustling cities where life moved at a breakneck speed. Here, in this secluded haven, time seemed to saunter leisurely. Chris, stepping into the shoes of his predecessor who had met a tragic end in an encounter with a predatory animal, carried with him a mixture of youthful arrogance and naivete. He was unaware of the full extent of the danger that had claimed his predecessor's life and harbored a quiet confidence in his ability to avoid a similar fate. His first order of business, as he set foot in this new chapter of his life, was to acquaint himself with the town and its inhabitants. As he strolled through the streets, his eyes studied the faces of the locals. They were the faces of simplicity and hard work, etched with lines that spoke of a life of toil and contentment. Their measured lives seemed to flow in a rhythm as old as the hills that cradled the town. The town, however, did harbor one peculiarity, or rather one peculiar inhabitant. In the local bar where conversations flowed as freely as the drinks, Chris learned of an eccentric old woman, known among the townsfolk as Crazy Grandma. She was a figure shrouded in mystery, an enigma that walked the streets, her presence weaving in and out of the everyday tapestry of the town. Her attire was a throwback to a bygone era, her clothes an eclectic mix of outdated fashions that hung loosely on her frail frame. Her hair, a tangled web of gray and white, framed a face that was as much a part of the town's landscape as the ancient buildings themselves. She was often seen wandering aimlessly, mumbling to herself in a language that seemed to belong to another time. The locals, accustomed to her presence, had warned Chris to pay her no mind. They spoke of her with a mix of dismissal and caution, as if she were a harmless relic of the past that was best left undisturbed. Chris was assigned a modest cabin nestled near the edge of an expansive forest. The house, seasoned by time, possessed a simple charm. Its cozy interior, a welcoming contrast to the sprawling woods beyond. Settling in took several days, during which Chris became fully familiar with the town and its people. Soon after, he embarked on his journey as a full-time ranger. As dawn broke, Chris commenced his duties. The forest, blanketed in snow, lay before him, a realm awaiting his careful stewardship. He dressed warmly, each layer a necessary shield against the winter's chill, and set out with steady strides, his boots imprinting a solitary trail in the untouched snow. His daily patrol was an exercise in vigilance and patience. Chris's eyes, trained to discern the subtlest of signs, scanned the landscape. The deer trails, mere indentations in the snow, spoke of the forest's inhabitants and their nocturnal wanderings. The distant calls of birds, muffled by the dense canopy, provided a natural soundtrack to his expedition. Part of his role entailed monitoring the well-being of the wildlife. The forest's denizens, from the smallest bird to the most elusive mammal, were under his watchful eye. He also surveyed the trails, now obscured by snow, for signs of wear or obstruction, ensuring they remained passable and safe. The trees, too, were his concern. Chris inspected their trunks and branches, looking for any signs of disease or damage. His hands, though encased in gloves, worked with precision, clearing snow-laden branches and checking the health of each tree. Midday found Chris in a sunlit clearing, where he paused to record his observations. His notes were meticulous, a written testament to the day's findings. He then moved on to a frozen stream, its surface a solid sheet of ice. Testing its thickness was critical, a precaution for any who might venture across. His lunch was a brief affair, taken in the quiet solitude of the forest. Even as he ate, his senses remained attuned to the woods around him. The winter forest was not a place for complacency. As he walked along one of the paths, something unusual caught his attention. A multitude of footprints, unusual and out of place against the usual tracks left by forest dwellers. These footprints, oddly shaped and spaced, didn't resemble any animal he knew. Intrigued but cautious, Chris made a mental note to revisit this anomaly. His training had taught him the importance of careful observation before action. However, his plans for a thorough investigation were abruptly interrupted. A group of hikers, their faces etched with concern and fear, approached him. They spoke of a grisly discovery deep in the woods, a dead animal, but not just any animal. The description they gave was of a creature so brutally mutilated that it barely resembled anything from the natural world. Abandoning his usual patrol route, Chris followed the hikers to the location of their disturbing find. The sight that greeted him was macabre, to say the least. There, in a small clearing, lay the remains of a deer. But it was no ordinary death by predation. The deer's body was dismembered, its parts strewn about with a seeming disregard for nature's order. The blood, or what should have been there, was conspicuously absent, as if drained completely. Chris surveyed the scene with a meticulous eye, his mind racing to piece together what had happened. The usual telltale signs of an animal attack were missing. No tracks of a predator, no signs of a struggle. It was as if the deer had been placed there, its end coming not from the natural world but from a much more sinister source. The more he examined the scene, the more Chris felt a chilling realization creep upon him. The possibility that this was the work of a human loomed large in his mind. The methodical, almost surgical manner in which the deer had been dismembered suggested a level of planning and intent that was deeply unsettling. Yet, in his heart, Chris knew that jumping to conclusions without evidence was not the mark of a good ranger or a good detective. The forest had many secrets, some revealed only to those who were patient and observant. The night had draped itself over the ranger's cabin, a cloak of darkness punctuated only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves. It was this nocturnal stillness that made the sudden, strange sounds even more jarring to Chris. Awakened from a restless slumber, his senses immediately sharpened, attuned to the alien noises that encroached upon the sanctity of his rest. The footsteps were odd, uneven, and deliberate, pacing around the cabin in an unhurried rhythm. With cautious movements, Chris parted the curtains, his eyes straining to make sense of the shapes in the darkness. At first glance, the silhouettes appeared almost human, but as his eyes adjusted, a chilling realization dawned upon him. The figures bore horns, their forms more animal than man, casting bizarre, distorted shadows against the moonlit backdrop. His mind raced with possibilities. Wild animals, perhaps, straying closer to human habitation than usual. Something about their outlines seemed off, their movements not quite fitting the natural gait of woodland creatures. Opting for caution, Chris chose to remain within the safety of his cabin, hoping the strange visitors would soon lose interest and retreat into the forest. But the night unfolded differently. The creatures, whatever they were, continued their eerie promenade around his home, their actions almost ritualistic in nature. It was as if they were performing some arcane ceremony, their slow, deliberate steps a dance to a rhythm only they could hear. As dawn broke, the strange symphony ceased, leaving Chris fatigued and unnerved. The morning light brought a semblance of normalcy, but the echoes of the night's oddities lingered in his mind. Seeking a distraction and the comforting routine of daily chores, he ventured to the local store for groceries. The store, a hub of the small community, was a place where news traveled fast, and tales, both tall and true, were exchanged. Sharing his nocturnal experience with the store owner, Chris hoped for some insight, perhaps an explanation rooted in the natural world he was so familiar with. The owner, however, dismissed his words with a smile, saying that the gamekeeper, as a connoisseur of nature, should know better the habits of animals. Yet it was not the store owner's words that unsettled Chris, but the gaze of the man's 7-year-old son. The boy's eyes held a cold, predatory quality, his smile enigmatic and unnerving. There was a depth to his stare that seemed uncharacteristic for one so young, a knowingness that sent a shiver down Chris's spine. Despite the unease that this brief interaction sparked, Chris tried to brush it off. He reminded himself that the imagination of a man who spends his days and nights in the vast, often mysterious wilderness can sometimes play tricks on him. Focusing on the tangible tasks of his role as a ranger, he endeavored to put the strangeness of the past night and the disconcerting encounter at the store out of his mind. 2 days had elapsed since the peculiar occurrences that had disturbed the ranger's nocturnal peace. The normalcy of his daily patrols had offered a brief respite, a chance to ascribe the events to the overactive imagination of a solitary man in the vast wilderness. However, this fragile semblance of order was about to be shattered. On a routine patrol, Chris stumbled upon a scene that violently jerked him back to the realm of the unexplained. At the forest's edge, hidden among the undergrowth, lay the lifeless form of a cow. It was a sight gruesomely familiar. The animal's body was mutilated, its innards removed with a precision that defied natural predators, and like the deer before, drained of blood. The discovery cemented Chris's growing suspicion that these were not isolated incidents. An unnerving pattern was emerging, one that pointed to a sinister presence in the forest. Determined to seek answers, he headed to the local sheriff's office, a bastion of law in the small community. The sheriff, a seasoned man of the law, listened as Chris recounted his findings. In response, he brought up past incidents, particularly a case involving a group of students arrested for animal cruelty years ago. He suggested that the recent events might be the work of tourists engaging in macabre pranks, a theory that did little to alleviate Chris's concerns. His intuition told him that something more malevolent was at play. The methodical nature of the mutilations, the deliberate removal of blood. These were not the hallmarks of mere pranks. Leaving the sheriff's office with more questions than answers, Chris stopped to refuel his car, his mind a whirlpool of thoughts. It was there, at the gas station, that he encountered her, the crazy grandmother. She emerged from the shadows like a specter, her presence as unsettling as it was unexpected. Her words, cryptic and chilling, echoed in the silent space between them. On the 8th day, on the 8th moon, the 8th victim must be a young soul, and then the master of eternal life will awaken. The words hung in the air, a riddle wrapped in madness. For a moment, Chris was taken aback, his rational mind grappling with the absurdity of her statement. Yet, recalling the locals' advice to pay her no heed, he dismissed her words as the ramblings of a disturbed mind. But deep down, a seed of doubt was planted, watered by the inexplicable events he had been witnessing. His drive back home was a journey through his own tumultuous thoughts. The recent events, the mutilated animals, the old woman's enigmatic words, all swirled in his mind, forming a tapestry of darkness that he could not yet fully comprehend. In the days that followed, a deceptive calm settled over the park. The ranger, Chris, went about his daily rounds, the forest seemingly returning to its natural order. No more disturbing finds marred the tranquility of the woods, leading him to hope, albeit cautiously, that the eerie events had come to an end. However, this semblance of normalcy was shattered during one of his deep forest patrols. There, in a clearing that rarely saw human presence, lay a sight that reignited his worst fears. A bear, its massive form a testament to the might of nature, lay torn and lifeless. Like the animals before it, the bear's body was a grotesque display of savagery, its flesh ripped open, the blood eerily absent. This grim discovery eradicated any notion that the previous incidents were mere pranks by hikers. The scale and ferocity of this act spoke of something far more sinister, something that transcended the bounds of normal forest predations. With a heavy heart and a mind swirling with dark thoughts, Chris sought out the sheriff once more. Their conversation was a gravely serious exchange of fears and suspicions. Chris expressed his growing alarm, convinced that they were dealing with a threat both unusual and extremely dangerous. In response to this escalating crisis, they resolved to conduct a comprehensive survey of the forest. Their search was meticulous, covering the dense underbrush, the towering trees, and the hidden nooks that only the most experienced of rangers and lawmen knew. It was in one such secluded area that they stumbled upon a discovery that sent chills down their spines. Hidden away from the well-trodden paths, they found a small pit. Around it lay the remains of various animals, their carcasses forming a grim circle. The site resembled a macabre altar, a place of dark and unholy rites. Animal bones were strewn haphazardly, their broken forms telling tales of unspeakable acts. Bloody hides, marked with strange symbols, hung from the trees like ghastly banners. The symbols were unfamiliar, arcane in appearance, and seemed to throb with an ominous intent. The pit itself was a gaping maw in the earth, its interior stained a deep purple black. The discoloration suggested that it had held a considerable quantity of blood, a reservoir for whatever sinister purpose this place served. This harrowing sight only deepened the ranger's sense of horror and bewilderment. He stood there, alongside the sheriff, feeling a creeping dread. It dawned on him that they were facing something that lay beyond the scope of their normal experience and knowledge. This was not the work of a mere predator or a group of misguided youths. This was something other, something that whispered of ancient and malevolent secrets. The ghastly discovery in the forest had left the ranger, Chris, in a state of deep anxiety and bewilderment. Standing beside the sheriff in the ominous silence of the woods, he couldn't help but voice his darkest fears. The scene before them, he suggested, bore the hallmarks of a sinister ritual or sacrifice, something far removed from the ordinary crimes they were used to handling. The sheriff, a man seasoned by years of law enforcement in this seemingly peaceful town, listened intently. He acknowledged Chris's concerns but was quick to remind him of the town's long-standing reputation for peace and order. The possibility that locals could be involved in such heinous acts seemed remote to him. Yet the evidence was hard to dismiss, and the sheriff agreed that further investigation was necessary. As they made their way back from the dense cover of the forest, the sheriff attempted to assuage Chris's growing apprehensions. he promised a thorough investigation into these disturbing events, though he admitted that the answers were not readily apparent. In the following days, the ranger dedicated himself to scouring the forest for more clues. His patrols became longer, his eyes searching every nook and cranny of the vast wilderness, but each effort seemed to lead nowhere. His conversations with the sheriff offered little in the way of comfort. The investigation was ongoing, but progress was painfully slow. The lack of leads, the absence of suspects, and the mysterious nature of the crimes left them grasping at straws. Then, one night, as Chris gazed up at the sky, he saw it, a moon as red as blood, hanging low over the horizon. Its crimson hue cast a surreal glow over the forest, bathing the trees in a sinister light. This celestial phenomenon, occurring amidst the already troubling events, only served to heighten his anxiety. The sight of the blood-red moon stirred a tumult of emotions within him: fear, powerlessness, and a deep sense of unease. The very fabric of the life he knew seemed to unravel before his eyes. The mystery of the forest, the unexplained deaths, and now this ominous sign in the sky, all conspired to shake his resolve. Faced with these overwhelming circumstances, Chris found himself contemplating a decision he never thought he would consider. The thought of leaving the forest, the very place he had come to protect and cherish, now seemed like a viable option. The town, with its dark secrets and unsolved mysteries, felt increasingly oppressive. The ranger, Chris, burdened by the weight of recent events, made a decisive call to his superiors. He detailed the alarming discoveries: the dismembered animals, the mysterious blood-filled hole, the unsettling atmosphere that now hung over the forest. His voice, steady but tinged with an undeniable urgency, conveyed the gravity of the situation. His superior's response, however, was not what Chris had anticipated. In a tone heavy with gravitas, he divulged a chilling piece of information. The ranger who preceded Chris had met his end in these very woods, under circumstances eerily similar to the ones now unfolding. This revelation struck Chris like a physical blow, the words reverberating in his mind like a sinister echo from a forgotten nightmare. Shaken to his core, Chris found himself requesting a transfer, a decision that felt both cowardly and prudent in equal measure. His supervisor, understanding yet firm, agreed to the request but asked for a brief delay. Reluctantly, Chris acquiesced, a sense of duty wrestling with his desire for escape. The next day found him in the local store, a place that had become a familiar refuge amidst the chaos. The shopkeeper, a friendly face in a sea of uncertainties, engaged him in conversation. When Chris mentioned his plans to leave, the reaction was one of genuine surprise and sadness. The shopkeeper spoke of how the townspeople had warmed to Chris, seeing in him not just a guardian of the forest, but a potential friend and ally. Chris, touched by this sentiment, promised to return someday, though the words felt hollow even as they left his lips. Exiting the store, he noticed the shopkeeper's young son playing outside. The boy, previously a source of unease for Chris, was engrossed in a game with his ball. Attempting to cast aside his reservations, Chris offered a friendly smile and greeted the boy. In response, the child paused, looked up, and with an impish grin, displayed the number 8 with his fingers before running off with a loud, carefree laugh. This simple gesture, innocent though it may have seemed, sent a ripple of disquiet through Chris. The number 8, a recurring motif in the strange events and cryptic messages he had encountered, now seemed to mock him from the lips of a child. With a mind swirling with questions and a heart heavy with unspoken fears, Chris made his way back to his cabin. The drive was a solitary journey through a landscape that felt both familiar and alien. The trees, the winding paths, the very air he breathed, all seemed to whisper secrets he could not decipher. As he parked his car and stepped out, the quiet of the forest enveloped him. The ranger stood there, a lone figure caught between the life he knew and a mystery that seemed to grow deeper with each passing day. The decision to leave, once a distant thought, now loomed large in his mind. A possible escape from a reality that had become too strange, too menacing. That night, as a silvery moon climbed its way into the star-studded canvas of the sky, the ranger, Chris, lay restless in his cabin. His attempts to find solace in the sanctuary of sleep were futile. Chris lay in his bed, his eyes wide open, staring at the wooden ceiling of his cabin. Each creak of the timbers, each whisper of the wind against the window panes, seemed to speak of the mysteries and anxieties that had enveloped his life in recent weeks. His thoughts wandered through the maze of recent events. The mutilated animals, the blood-filled pit, the cryptic words of the crazy grandmother, and the boy's unnerving gesture. Each memory was a puzzle piece that refused to fit, creating a picture that was increasingly disturbing and incomprehensible. As the hours crawled by, a familiar sense of restlessness took hold of Chris. He rose from his bed, the sheets falling away like the remnants of a forgotten dream. He moved to the window, his hands gripping the sill as he peered into the night. The moon hung low, a celestial orb casting its pale, ethereal glow over the forest. It was then that the sounds began, the soft yet distinct footsteps, the faint rustle of movement outside his cabin. As if on cue, the familiar, unsettling noises returned, the soft, deliberate footsteps, the ghostly silhouettes of horned creatures dancing in the moonlight. But this time, exhausted and irritated after recent events, Chris decides to disperse the animals from the property. Moving with purpose, Chris retrieved his shotgun from its place on the wall. The weight of the gun in his hands was both a comfort and a reminder of the potential danger that lay ahead. He dressed quickly, donning his jacket and boots, his movements methodical, driven by a newfound resolve. Stepping outside, the cool night air greeted him, a stark contrast to the warmth of the cabin. He scanned the surroundings, his eyes trying to penetrate the darkness that hugged the edges of the moonlit clearing. But as he ventured further, a profound silence enveloped the area. The footsteps ceased abruptly, the sense of being watched intensified, yet there was no sign of the creatures. Chris circled the cabin, his senses on high alert, searching for any movement, any indication of the presence he felt lurking just beyond sight. The normal nocturnal chorus of the forest seemed muted, as if the creatures of the night too sensed the abnormality of the situation. This oppressive quiet, this absence of life, only heightened Chris's sense of dread. Realizing the abnormality of the situation, the ranger decides to return to the cabin. As he made his way back to the cabin, a sudden, excruciating pain exploded at the back of his head. It was swift and disorienting, a force that sent him reeling. The ground rushed up to meet him, the sky and trees swirling in a dizzying dance. In that fleeting moment of consciousness, he saw it. A figure towering over him, a grotesque parody of man and beast, its eyes reflecting the moonlight with a malevolent gleam. Then, darkness swept over him, a thick, suffocating blanket of unconsciousness. He lay there, vulnerable and exposed, at the mercy of the mysterious figure that had emerged from the night. Consciousness returned to Chris slowly, a creeping awareness that dragged him out of the depths of darkness. His head throbbed with a pulsating pain, a relentless drumbeat that echoed through his skull. He tried to move, but his limbs refused to obey, stretched out and bound in an unnatural pose that sent waves of panic through his foggy mind. His eyes flickered open, adjusting to the dim light that filtered through the dense canopy of trees. The sight that greeted him was one of horror, a tableau so macabre and surreal that for a moment he wondered if he was still ensnared in the clutches of a nightmare. But the cold, hard reality soon set in, anchoring him to a terrifying present. He was suspended over a pit, vast and ominous, its depths filled with a substance that shimmered darkly under the moonlight. It was blood, he realized with a sickening lurch in his stomach, a pool of crimson that seemed to absorb the very light around it. In the center of this gruesome scene lay a human body, desiccated and discolored, resembling more a mummy than a once-living being. Its arms were crossed over its chest in a pose that spoke of ancient rituals and forgotten rites. The eyes were closed, the face serene yet haunting, a silent guardian of this unholy sanctuary. Chris's own position mirrored the form of crucifixion, his arms and legs stretched out and bound to the surrounding trees. He could feel the tightness of the ropes cutting into his skin, the vulnerability of his exposed and half-undressed body. On his torso, painted with a substance he dared not identify, was a symbol mysterious and sinister, its lines and curves unfamiliar. All around him, the forest seemed to close in, the trees like silent witnesses to the dark ceremony unfolding beneath their boughs. Animal skins, marked with the same strange symbols that adorned his body, hung from the branches, swaying gently in the night breeze. They formed a macabre tapestry, a backdrop to the ritual that had ensnared him. His mind raced, trying to piece together the events that had led him here. The last thing he remembered was the goat-headed figure, the blow to his head, and then nothing but darkness. Now he found himself the centerpiece of a scene that seemed ripped from the pages of a dark, forgotten lore. Fear gripped him, a primal, all-consuming terror that threatened to overwhelm his senses. He was alone, helpless, a pawn in a game whose rules and players were unknown to him. The pain in his head, the tightness of his bonds, the chilling sight of the blood-filled pit, all of it felt like a descent into madness. But beneath the fear, a spark of defiance flickered. As he hung there, suspended between earth and sky, Chris forced himself to take stock of his surroundings. He needed to understand, to observe, to plan. His training had taught him the value of observation, the need to see beyond the immediate terror and discern the details that could mean the difference between life and death. The mummy-like figure in the pit, the symbols on the skins and his body, the arrangement of the site, all of it was part of a narrative that he needed to understand. Who had brought him here? What was the purpose of this ritual? And most importantly, how could he escape this nightmare? The darkness around him began to stir, giving way to a procession of figures that emerged from the shadows, like phantoms materializing from another realm. They advanced in a formation that was both methodical and eerie, each step deliberate, resonating with a purpose that Chris could neither comprehend nor escape. In their hands, they held wooden sticks, each twisted and contorted into symbols that seemed to defy the natural order of wood. As these figures encircled Chris and the altar, the moonlight revealed their visages, human faces obscured by animal masks, some adorned with horns and others with features so grotesque that they seemed to belong more to nightmare than to nature. Their eyes, visible through the masks, burned with an intensity that was both human and otherworldly. The ranger's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a drum of primal fear and disbelief. These were the same creatures he had seen near his cabin, the shadows that had haunted his nights and fueled his fears. Now, they moved around him in a ritual dance, their bodies swaying to a rhythm that was felt rather than heard, their voices chanting in a language that was as incomprehensible as it was chilling. Then, from the midst of this macabre assembly, one figure stepped forward. The man removed his goat mask, revealing a face that struck Chris with a horror far greater than the mask itself. It was the sheriff, his features twisted in an expression that bore no trace of the man Chris had known. The revelation was a blow more devastating than any physical wound, a betrayal that cut to the very core of his being. Panic surged through Chris as he struggled against his bonds, the ropes biting into his flesh with each futile attempt to free himself. But his efforts were in vain. He was ensnared, both physically and within the web of a ritual that was as old as it was sinister. The sheriff, now a figure of dread and authority, approached Chris with a knife in hand. The blade glinted in the moonlight, a harbinger of pain and violence. With a swift, deliberate motion, the sheriff plunged the knife into Chris's side, just under the ribs. A searing pain exploded within him, a fiery agony that spread through his body like wildfire. Blood, warm and profuse, began to flow from the wound, joining the other offerings that soaked the altar. Chris's vision blurred, the figures around him merging into a swirling vortex of masks, symbols, and shadows. The chant of the masked figures grew louder, their voices melding into a cacophony that seemed to resonate with the very earth beneath them. In this moment of excruciating pain and utter helplessness, Chris realized the full extent of his plight. He was the centerpiece of a ritual that was as much a part of this forest as the trees and the soil. A ritual that spoke of a darkness that lay hidden beneath the veneer of the town's tranquility. He was number 8, a young soul, a young victim. As the ritual reached its crescendo, the figures around him seemed to grow in intensity, their dance more frenetic, their chants more fervent. The forest itself seemed to respond, the wind picking up, the trees swaying as if in rhythm with the dark ceremony. Chris, his consciousness ebbing away under the assault of pain and loss, could only watch in horror and disbelief as the ritual unfolded around him. The sheriff, now a priest of this ancient and unholy rite, stood over him, a figure of power and terror. The pain from the knife wound was a searing, unrelenting torment, a physical manifestation of the betrayal and horror that surrounded him. With a voice strained by agony and disbelief, he managed to utter a question to the sheriff, the man he had once considered an ally, a protector of the town's peace. "For what? What did I do to deserve this?" he gasped, each word a laborious effort. The sheriff, his face a mask of cold detachment, smiled, a chilling echo of the sinister grin Chris had seen on the shopkeeper's son. "Being you is bliss," he said, his voice devoid of empathy. With these cryptic words, he plunged the knife into Chris again, twisting it with a cruel precision. As the ranger's vision blurred, his life force ebbing away, he witnessed a scene that would have been dismissed as a fevered hallucination under any other circumstances. The mummified corpse in the pit, an ancient relic of a forgotten time, began to stir. Its eyes snapped open, glowing with an unholy light, as it slowly, purposefully, rose from its resting place. Illuminated by the moon's ghastly hue, the corpse transformed before Chris's fading eyes. It shed its desiccated skin, morphing into a monstrous entity, a being that defied the laws of nature and life. Its form was grotesque, a nightmarish fusion of human and otherworldly features, its eyes burning with a malevolent intelligence. As this abomination began to drink the blood that pooled beneath Chris, the sheriff fell to his knees, his voice rising in a fervent prayer. "Master of eternal life, our Lord, grant us enlightenment," he intoned, his words a reverent offering to the creature that now held dominion over them. These moments, unfolding in a tableau of mysticism and horror, were the last that Chris would witness. His consciousness slipped away, leaving him in a limbo between the world he knew and a realm of ancient dark secrets. The pain, the fear, the betrayal, all faded into the shadows of oblivion. The ritual reached its zenith, the forest echoing with the chants of the masked figures and the whispers of the trees. The creature, now fully risen, towered over the scene, a symbol of power and terror that had been awakened by the blood and faith of its followers. The sheriff, along with the others, looked on with a mix of awe and fervor. They were disciples of a forgotten god, practitioners of rites that harkened back to a time when the line between man and myth was blurred. Their actions were not born of madness, but of a belief in a power that transcended the mundane reality of their existence. As the ritual concluded, the creature turned its gaze upon the assembled crowd, its eyes reflecting the blood-red moon. As the first rays of the morning sun broke through the thick crowns of the towering trees, a transformation began. The vast expanse of ancient forest stirred under the cold breath of dawn. The mist, ethereal and ghostly, began its slow dance over the ground. It crept with the patience of time, a white spirit weaving its light blanket over the earth. This mist, seemingly sentient, found its way through every nook, cradling each bush, tree, and blade of grass in its chilly embrace. The ground, hardened by the kiss of frost, offered resistance underfoot. Each step crunched through the fresh snow, a sound akin to ancient parchment being carefully unfolded, revealing secrets long hidden. This was no solitary journey. The steady, rhythmic footsteps of people moving through the forest broke the sanctity of the morning, an intrusion of human existence into the natural symphony. It was a group of police officers and FBI agents. For 2 weeks, they tackled a confusing and disturbing investigation, the mass disappearance of town residents, including the sheriff, a young park ranger, and numerous residents, both young and old. The case was as baffling as it was distressing. The sudden vanishing of these individuals, without a trace or a clue, had sent ripples of unease and fear through the community and beyond. The police and federal agents were at a loss. Theories abounded, ranging from an orchestrated abduction to a mass exodus, orchestrated for reasons unknown, yet none held up under scrutiny. The absence of concrete evidence or leads only deepened the mystery. Teams of officers, accompanied by K-9 units, combed through the dense forest, their movements meticulous and systematic. They scoured every inch, from the underbrush to the tree lines, hoping to uncover any sign of the missing persons. But the forest, with its towering trees and sprawling undergrowth, seemed to guard its secrets jealously. Each search yielded no results, the woods remaining silent witnesses to a mystery that was as confounding as it was worrying. As the group ventured deeper, the forest's character shifted. The snow-laden branches of the trees bent gracefully under their burden, forming natural arches and tunnels. Sunlight, in its quest to touch the earth, broke through these formations, scattering the fog and revealing the forest's hidden depths. In the midst of this serene atmosphere, there came a moment of discord. One of the policemen stopped with his arm outstretched, pointing forward. A disturbing picture slowly emerged through the thinning mist. At the base of a majestic tree, its roots deeply embedded in the frozen ground, lay a body. A man. His clothes were in tatters and his skin was disfigured and bloody. The group cautiously moved closer, not wanting to disturb the eerie calm of the scene. The man's body showed evidence of a violent end. His stomach had been ripped open, and he looked like a mummy. Scattered around him were the remnants of a life suddenly cut short. His face, frozen in an expression of horror, seemed to stare at an unseen terror, a secret kept in its eternal silence. It was Chris, the young ranger who had been victim number 8.
Story 2.
The city had always been my sanctuary, a sprawling labyrinth where anonymity wasn't just a possibility, but a guarantee. Skyscrapers stretched towards the heavens like concrete titans, each one a testament to human ingenuity and ambition. The unceasing hum of traffic and distant sirens were my lullabies, and the neon glow of billboards and streetlights, my stars. But now, as I sat behind the wheel of my aging sedan, the only lights guiding me were the dim headlights cutting through an ocean of darkness. The assignment from the paper seemed straightforward enough: cover the local festival of a small town. A slice of Americana, my editor had said, his voice crackling over the phone. The drive was monotonous, a seemingly endless parade of twists and turns, flanked by an impenetrable wall of trees. Their branches swayed gently in the evening breeze, casting ghostly shadows on the road. The world beyond the city had always seemed alien to me, and this was no exception. The further I drove, the more I felt like an intruder in a foreign land. When the town finally emerged from the embrace of the wilderness, it was exactly as I had pictured. A relic from a bygone era. The buildings, lined up along the main street like weary soldiers, bore the scars of time. Paint, once vibrant and welcoming, now hung in tattered strips from wooden facades. Windows, clouded with the dust of decades, offered a glimpse into empty rooms and forgotten stories. It was as if the town itself was caught in a temporal loop, stubbornly clinging to the past while the rest of the world moved forward. The streets were deserted, save for a stray cat that watched me with suspicious eyes before disappearing into the shadows. I parked my car near what appeared to be the town's diner, its neon sign flickering intermittently, struggling to spell out the word, "Eat." Stepping out of the car, I was struck by the silence. It was a stark contrast to the constant cacophony of the city. I took a moment to stretch my legs, my joints protesting after the long drive. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. As I ventured deeper into the heart of the festivities, the reality of the town's celebration began to unfold before me, in a panorama of bizarre and unsettling imagery. The streets, normally quiet and unassuming, were transformed into a bustling thoroughfare of color, sound, and enigmatic fervor. Ahead, a procession advanced through the center of the town, which had been cordoned off for the occasion. Flute players led the way, their melodies haunting and discordant, intertwining with the rhythmic beat of drums that seemed to echo the very heartbeat of the town. They danced with an abandon that was both mesmerizing and disconcerting, their bodies moving in ways that suggested a deep, almost primal connection to the music. Following the musicians was a spectacle that sent a chill down my spine. A crowd of men and women, their bodies scantily clad and smeared with vibrant reds and blues, bore upon their shoulders a statue so grotesque it could have been ripped from the pages of a dark fairy tale. Carved with painstaking detail, the figure depicted a half-man, half-goat entity, its face a fusion of human and animalistic features, complete with elongated, curling horns and fangs that protruded like those of a vampire. It was not just the craftsmanship that unsettled me, but the reverence with which it was carried, as if this effigy was more deity than art. The townspeople who followed were a spectacle in themselves. Paint obscured their faces, giving them an otherworldly appearance. Their movements were not mere walking. They swayed and twisted, seemingly caught in a trance induced by the rhythm of the procession. My task was clear yet daunting: to capture the essence of this peculiar festival, to peel back the layers of its history and traditions. But as I waded through the sea of painted faces and tried to engage with the locals, I was met with resistance. Questions were deflected with nervous smiles or outright ignored. It was apparent that there was a veil over this town, a collective pact of silence that no outsider was meant to penetrate. The more I observed, the more the festival's veneer of quaint eccentricity gave way to a sense of something more profound and disquieting. I watched as groups gathered in circles, their chants low and rhythmic, their eyes closed in fervent concentration. Stalls lined the streets, offering an array of odd trinkets and artifacts, each seemingly holding its own cryptic significance. The townspeople, their faces obscured by the fading light, moved with a rhythm that seemed orchestrated yet chaotic. I noted every detail, the journalist in me refusing to let the unsettling atmosphere cloud my observations. The wooden statue, the centerpiece of this bizarre ritual, loomed over us, its goat-headed visage staring blankly into the distance. As we ventured deeper into the forest that cradled the town, the natural chorus of evening creatures began to crescendo. Crickets chirped their twilight songs, and the rustling leaves whispered secrets of their own. Yet, amidst this natural symphony, the footsteps of the townsfolk maintained their steady, unnerving rhythm, as if keeping time with some unseen conductor. The air grew denser as the sun relinquished its hold on the sky, surrendering to the encroaching night. The darkness of the forest seemed to absorb all light, creating a canvas where shadows played and merged. The further we walked, the more I felt the weight of the unseen eyes that seemed to watch us from the darkened underbrush. The procession continued, the forest enveloping us in its ancient embrace. The night was now upon us, and with it came a chill that seemed to seep into my very bones. The townsfolk's faces, barely visible in the dim light, were etched with an expression that I couldn't quite decipher. Was it anticipation, fear, or something else entirely? The forest, a labyrinth of ancient trees, seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The branches above intertwined in a macabre dance, casting shadowy patterns that played tricks on my eyes. It was as if the forest itself was alive, breathing, and watching. The ground beneath my feet felt almost sentient, a soft, spongy surface that seemed to absorb the sound of my steps, muffling my movements as if urging me to tread silently, reverently. The townspeople, their faces now mere ghostly visages in the dwindling light, continued their procession. Each step they took was in perfect unison, a choreography that spoke of years of practice, or perhaps something more innate, more primal. Their chant, a melody of an unknown language, sounded both beautiful and foreboding. It echoed through the trees, bouncing off the bark and leaves, creating a chorus that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Their faces, painted in hues of black and red, transformed under the canopy's dim light. The paint, meticulously applied, gave them an otherworldly appearance, as if they were no longer mere humans, but spirits of the forest, enacting a ritual as old as the woods themselves. Despite my journalistic instincts screaming for me to turn back, to retreat to the safety of the known, my feet carried me forward, deeper into the unknown. There was a story here, hidden beneath the layers of tradition and fear, a story that begged to be uncovered. But with each step, the unease in my gut grew, a tangible entity that seemed to feed on my fear. The ground beneath our feet became uneven, littered with fallen leaves and twisted roots that snaked across our path like slithering serpents. Suddenly, the procession came to an abrupt halt, jarring me from my thoughts. We had reached a clearing, a space where the trees reluctantly parted ways, as if to reveal a sacred spot. My eyes were immediately drawn to the centerpiece of this clearing, a massive ancient tree. Its bark was dark, almost black, resembling weathered leather that had seen countless seasons. Its roots spread out in a complex network, like the tendrils of some great beast, anchoring it firmly to the earth. Nestled at the base of this imposing tree was the wooden statue we had been following, its goat-headed form more sinister here in the shadow of the ancient arboreal giant. The townspeople formed a circle around it, their chanting intensifying, the sound echoing through the clearing and bouncing off the tree trunks, creating a cacophony that set my nerves on edge. My gaze then shifted to something that sent a shiver down my spine. A crude altar stood a few feet away from the tree. It was adorned with symbols that seemed to dance and flicker in the dim light, symbols that spoke of ancient rites and forgotten gods. The altar was decorated with relics made from what appeared to be animal bones, each piece meticulously placed, as if it held significant meaning in this macabre tableau. As the chanting continued, its rhythm more urgent now, the townsfolk brought forth a trembling goat from a small, hidden cage. The animal's eyes were wide with fear, mirroring the growing horror within me. I had only seen such rituals depicted in films, dramatic and sanitized. But here, in the cold reality of the forest, the ritual was starkly visceral, its dark intent laid bare. With a heavy heart and a sense of impending doom, I watched as they bound the goat to the altar. Its plaintive bleats were drowned out by the relentless chanting, a soundtrack to a ritual that I knew would haunt me for years to come. The leader of the procession, a shadowy figure cloaked in tattered robes, stepped forward with a solemnity that commanded silence. In his hands, he held a wicked-looking knife, its blade glinting ominously in the dim light. My heart pounded in my chest as he raised the knife high above his head, a gesture that signaled the culmination of this nightmarish ritual. In that moment, time seemed to slow. The air grew thick with anticipation, and a hush fell over the clearing. And then, with a swift, practiced motion, the leader brought the knife down. The goat's pitiful cries pierced the night, a sound so raw and agonizing that it threatened to overwhelm my senses. I stood there, frozen, as the lifeblood of the animal spilled onto the altar in a dark, crimson flow. This was no longer a distant story to be reported. It had become a visceral, chilling reality. Despite the revulsion churning in my gut, I knew I had to document this. Every horrifying detail needed to be recorded, a testament to the dark depths of human ritual and superstition. The townspeople moved with a renewed fervor now, their chants rising in a cacophony of eerie melody. They took turns drinking from a bowl filled with the goat's blood, each one seeming to draw strength from the act. Their faces, painted and grotesque in the flickering light, were alight with a fervent zeal that was almost palpable. Then, in a twist that sent a cold shiver down my spine, they turned to me. Eyes alight with an unsettling mixture of invitation and command, they presented me with a chalice. It was filled with the same dark, warm blood I had just seen spilled. Their smiles, wide and expectant, filled me with a dread that went beyond mere fear. It was as if they were initiating me into a world beyond my understanding, a realm of ancient and forbidden practices. With a trembling hand, I took the chalice. The metallic scent of the blood was overpowering, and for a moment, I hesitated. But the weight of their stares was too much to bear. Closing my eyes, I brought the chalice to my lips and took a small sip. The taste, coppery and warm, coated my tongue and sent a wave of nausea through me. It was a violation of every instinct, every moral fiber I possessed. With a trembling hand, I returned the chalice to the townsfolk. The metallic tang of blood lingered in my mouth, an unwelcome reminder of my forced participation in this grotesque ritual. I felt a wave of nausea and guilt wash over me, but my instinct for self-preservation reigned supreme. Surrounded by the fervor of the townspeople, my isolation became starkly apparent. My curiosity, once a driving force, now seemed a foolish gamble against these overwhelming odds. As the villagers resumed their ritualistic chanting, their voices crescendoed into a deafening roar. They circled the statue and the ancient tree, their movements becoming more frenzied, more hypnotic. I lifted my gaze, trying to detach myself from the chaos, but a sudden dizziness overtook me. The forest, once a mere backdrop to this madness, seemed to warp and shift before my eyes. The shadows, cast by the flickering light of lanterns, danced around me in a sinister ballet. They moved with a fluidity that defied the natural order, merging and twisting into shapes that my mind struggled to comprehend. The faces of the townspeople, already grotesque with their ritualistic paint, began to blur and distort, morphing into nightmarish visages that seemed to leer at me from every direction. Even the trees appeared to take on a life of their own, Their branches writhed and contorted like serpentine creatures, reaching out towards me with a malevolent intent. It was as if the forest itself had become an extension of the ritual, an active participant in the unfolding horror. Panic, raw and unyielding, surged within me. I stumbled backward, my every instinct screaming to flee from this nightmare. But the townspeople were everywhere, their laughter and chants morphing into a cacophony that drowned out all rational thought. I realized then that my role in this ritual was far from over. I had unwittingly become part of a madness far greater and more terrifying than anything I could have imagined. Reeling from the effects of the blood and the surreal turn of events, the forest around me seemed to fracture and distort. Trees twisted into grotesque shapes, their branches snaking towards me with a sinister purpose. Shadows, elongated and warped by the lantern light, slithered and writhed on the ground, creating a tableau that defied logic. The cacophony of laughter and chants from the townsfolk rang in my ears, a haunting reminder of the nightmare I was desperately trying to escape. They closed in on me, their expressions twisted into grotesque parodies of joy. The very ground beneath my feet seemed to betray me, shifting and undulating like the waves of a tempestuous sea, making my every step precarious and fraught with danger. Driven by sheer desperation, I plunged deeper into the forest, away from the sinister ritual and the people who had ensnared me in their dark celebration. The shadows that had danced so malevolently around me now seemed to reach out, as if they were dark tendrils, eager to pull me into an abyss from which there was no return. My mind was a whirlwind of questions and fears. What had I unwittingly become a part of in this forgotten town? What hidden, twisted histories were woven into the fabric of its traditions? With each labored breath, I felt as if I was being drawn deeper into a mystery far beyond my understanding. The forest around me took on an increasingly surreal aspect. Trees now contorted into unnatural shapes, their bark twisted and gnarled, resembling the weathered skin of some ancient creature. The air grew colder, sending shivers down my spine, and a profound silence enveloped the woods, broken only by the faint, haunting echoes of the townsfolk's distant chanting. As I ventured deeper into the dense undergrowth, the rustling sound stopped me dead in my tracks. My heart pounded against my chest, a drumbeat of primal fear. Straining my eyes to pierce the oppressive darkness, I caught sight of something unsettling, a pair of glowing eyes, like twin embers burning in the night. Something was out there, hidden in the shadows, and the realization that I was not alone in this eerie wilderness sent a jolt of terror through me. My instincts screamed at me to run, to put as much distance between myself and those unblinking, fiery eyes. I pushed forward, my footsteps quickening, each step an effort to escape the unknown entity that lurked just beyond my sight. The forest seemed to conspire against me, its tangled underbrush slowing my progress. But then, almost by miracle, I stumbled onto a lonely road. The sudden shift from the wild terrain to the relatively smooth gravel felt surreal. Dizziness overwhelmed me, a sensation akin to a hangover, though alcohol hadn't touched my lips in years. I stood there for a moment, disoriented, gazing down the road that stretched endlessly into the inky blackness. There were no signs of civilization, no comforting glow of streetlights or distant hum of traffic. Only the eerie rustling of leaves and the faint, haunting echoes of the townsfolk's chants that now seemed to fade away into the night. Taking a hesitant step forward, I heard the gravel crunch under my feet, a stark contrast to the muffled steps in the forest's thick underbrush. I had barely begun to feel a sense of relief when a chilling noise shattered the silence. A low guttural sound, primal and threatening, sent a wave of shivers down my spine. I spun around, my eyes scanning the dense foliage, and there they were again, the glowing, fiery eyes, peering at me from the darkness. They seemed like nothing more than distant stars, fallen from the heavens to earth. But as they grew closer, inch by measured inch, they transformed into something far more sinister. Panic coursed through me, raw and unfiltered. My heart pounded in my chest, a frenetic drumbeat that seemed to sync with my hastening steps. I stumbled backward, my mind a chaotic symphony of terror and confusion. The creature, obscured in the shadows, was a presence as tangible as the trees around me, its glowing eyes a beacon of dread. As I retreated, my mind raced to make sense of what lurked in the darkness. Questions spun like a whirlwind. Was this some guardian of the forest, A specter of ancient legend? Or was it a more tangible threat, a creature of flesh and blood, albeit a form twisted into something grotesque? My journalistic instincts, usually so sharp and focused, were drowned out by the primal urge to survive, to escape from this unseen terror. Then, in a moment that seemed to straddle the line between reality and nightmare, the creature emerged from the underbrush. It moved with a disconcerting grace, each step deliberate and unhurried. The sight of it struck me with a visceral horror. This was no mere animal, nor was it a figment of my imagination. It was an abomination, a grotesque fusion of human and goat-like features that defied all natural laws. The creature's body was a horror unto itself. Covered in matted wool, it hung in twisted, dirty clumps from its misshapen form. The wool seemed to writhe as if alive, adding to the nightmarish quality of its appearance. Its limbs were a perversion of the human form, hooves where feet should be, elongated arms that hung limply, as if they were devoid of bone or sinew. But it was the creature's head that elicited a terror so profound, so primal, that it threatened to overwhelm me. The head of a goat, replete with long, spiraled horns that twisted upwards, reaching towards an uncaring sky. The horns gleamed with a malevolent sheen, as if they were fashioned from the darkness itself. Its eyes, the source of that eerie, fiery glow, were windows to a malignant intelligence. They burned with a malevolence that seemed ancient and inscrutable. When the creature opened its mouth, the sound that emerged was a chilling distortion of a goat's bleat, a sound no living creature should ever make. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very air, resonating with an unnatural malevolence. The sight of its fangs, reminiscent of a vampire's, dripping with fresh, red blood, was the final, horrifying detail in a visage so terrifying that it seemed to belong to the realm of nightmares rather than the natural world. As the creature stood there, regarding me with those burning eyes, a multitude of emotions battled within me. Fear was foremost among them, a fear so deep and visceral that it seemed to paralyze me. But there was also a sense of awe, of facing something so utterly alien to my understanding of the world. As a journalist, I had always sought the truth, delved into mysteries, and sought to shed light on the unknown. But in this moment, faced with a creature that defied explanation, I felt a deep sense of my own insignificance, a realization that some mysteries were perhaps too dark, too ancient to ever be truly understood. I stood there, caught in the creature's gaze, my mind struggling to process the horror before me. Questions raced through my mind, each more frantic than the last. What was this creature? What was its connection to the ritual I had witnessed, to the town and its people? And most importantly, what did it want from me? Gasping for air, my chest heaved in ragged breaths, each one a desperate attempt to draw oxygen into my lungs. It felt as though I were drowning on dry land, my body rebelling against the terror that gripped me. Cold sweat drenched my back, chilling me to the bone, yet my skin burned with fear. I fell to my knees, the gravel of the road biting into my flesh through the fabric of my pants. Paralyzed, I watched as the creature moved towards me with a fluid, unnatural grace. Its multi-jointed limbs carried it forward, each movement a testament to its otherworldly nature. As it drew closer, its glowing eyes locked onto mine, and a sense of helplessness overwhelmed me. I was caught in the gaze of a predator, an abomination from a world that my mind still struggled to accept as real. Just as the creature was about to reach me, a beacon of hope shattered the darkness. The bright headlights of a car rounded the corner, cutting through the night with a suddenness that was almost blinding. The light momentarily distracted me from the horror before me, offering a glimmer of salvation in this nightmare. The car screeched to a halt beside me, its tires spewing gravel into the air, a harsh contrast to the eerie silence that had enveloped the forest. The driver's side door swung open with urgency, and a voice, human and filled with concern, called out from inside. "Get in!" it urged, a command that pierced through my terror-induced paralysis. I turned back to where the creature had been, expecting to see its monstrous form looming over me. But there was nothing. The monster had vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving no trace of its existence. It was as if the creature had been nothing more than a figment of my tortured imagination, a specter born from the darkest depths of fear. Seizing the opportunity, I jumped to my feet with a burst of adrenaline-fueled energy. My legs, shaky and weak, somehow carried me to the car. I threw myself inside, the need to escape, to put distance between myself and the horrors of the forest, driving my every action. The driver, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and a rough demeanor, wasted no time in accelerating away from the scene. I breathed a sigh of relief, thankful to have escaped the clutches of the nightmarish creature that had pursued me. My savior, however, seemed unfazed by the ordeal. He glanced at me briefly, his eyes filled with curiosity, before returning his attention to the road. "My name is Bill. I'm a hunter, and I've been lingering in the woods. You're lucky I showed up right here, or you'd have a long time to wander around in the woods still," he grumbled, his voice hoarse. "What were you doing out in the middle of nowhere at this hour?" I struggled to find my voice, my mind still reeling from the encounter. I was covering a festival in a nearby town," I stammered. "But things took a very dark turn, and I had to run." The driver raised an eyebrow, his skepticism evident. "Festival, you say? What kind of festival?" I hesitated, then decided to reveal the truth. "It was a strange one," I began, my words carefully chosen. "The townspeople were involved in some disturbing ritual, and I was forced to partake in it." The driver gripped the steering wheel tighter and cast a leering glance at me. "What kind of townspeople? What kind of town is this?" he muttered. "It's disturbing. You're scaring me, boy." As I recounted the events of the night, the driver's expression grew graver. "But here's the thing," the driver finally said, his voice low and measured. "There's no town nearby. I mean, there used to be a town, but years ago there was some kind of tragedy there, and the inhabitants disappeared somewhere. So now there's no town with residents nearby, and the nearest living town is a few miles away. There's a festival going on there. But there's no way you can go to a festival in the middle of this forest." My blood ran cold at his words. I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced, was real, but his assertion threw me into a deeper sense of unease. How could I be in a city that doesn't exist? What happened to me?